Hi, I'm Anne Jackson. I'm a UX designer. I work at ServiceLink.
Remy Porter. I am a creative coder for IonTank, but a little more apropos for tonight, I'm also the editor-in-chief for the Daily WTF, where we collect IT horror stories about how processes go wrong.
And I'm Bruce Parr. I'm senior software engineer at Paylocity.
And as you can see, we're here for blameless retrospectives or post-mortems or whatever term you prefer for what you do after some process is done. We try and be pretty flexible about that in our presentation. There's a couple different ways we do that. That's not because we're inconsistent, it's intentional. That's my story and I'm sticking to it. There's just I'm blocking the camera, so I don't want to stand there. It's a little tricky with 3 people.
So you might ask, why are we here, right? So where this originally came from is Colin got a request from someone in the community and put a request out on the Slack channel to say, hey, who can talk about blameless post-mortems? And so Bruce and Remy and I independently, kind of said, well, we could probably help out with that. And so Colin's like, okay, the 3 of you figure it out. And so I think what we hope that you're going to take away from this is that each of us has different sets of experiences. And because all of you also have very different experiences, we feel like this is going to make this talk hopefully more valuable. And our goal is really to just encourage you to take your practice and take it to the next step. So we might not be doing retros. Start with yourself. Your team is doing retros, great. Do them more often. So wherever you are, there's room to kind of take it up to the next step. So that's kind of what this is all about, and to not be afraid. So can we're not setting this up to go, we have to click on it?
I think you can use an arrow key as well, but...
No.
Okay. Click worked. Overshot.
Okay. So, these are what we're going to talk about. What's a retrospective? Sometimes we say retro, sometimes we say post-mortem. Why do we do them? What's a good retrospective? Where do they go wrong, right? How do we adopt retros? What are tools that we can use? Kind of a retro toolbox to give you more flexibility depending on what your situation is. And maybe some guidance on building your own retro process.
And I think that last one's one of the important things to stress. We're not going to tell you exactly how to do a retrospective, because the retro is going to be driven by your team, by the people on the team, by the needs of your team. You need to build your own retro process. We're going to talk about how you can do that and some of the things to watch out for and how to do that. But this isn't a do these things and you've done a retrospective. This is, here's some things you want to accomplish and here's how you can get there.
Here's what we've done. Here's what we think works. Here's some things where we've seen things really go bad quick. So, thank you. Next.
We'll find out. We might just have to. So for Bruce, it's actually a Bruce.
Oh, is it? Let me come over here.
Sure.
It's easy. Well, maybe not. Oh, holy cow, need a microscope. All right, so the whole idea behind a retrospective is what we do as software engineers, as QA people involved in the development, in the design of what it is we're ultimately producing. It's a process. So the whole idea behind retrospective is process improvement at every stage. So if you think about it, what we do day to day in our involvement in IT, we're improving the software. We're definitely pushing out revisions to the software, improvement to the software, whether it's bug fixes or whether it's customer requests, things like that. So the retrospective, if you think about it, it's how do we improve ourselves, right? How do we improve ourselves as a team in order to continue to be able to develop, and in order to continue to be able to design, in order to continue to develop efficient deployment. So that's the whole concept. Now, if you're a true Agile shop or Scrum shop, typically you'll do it every 2 weeks. But like we said at the beginning, it's up to the team. really. I mean, I've been on teams. My current team, I've just got a new manager. I think it's my 9th manager since I've been at this company in less than 5 years. That's a whole nother story. But needless to say, almost all of them we did 2 week sprint. And the last team that I was on, or actually the last manager that I had, was more of a fire hose, more of a Kanban approach. And we were doing retros maybe monthly, maybe every other month. And just from my own experience, I think the 2 week really works well. Now, to speak to the difference between a retrospective and a post-mortem, I prefer, this is just my own preference, right? But I prefer retrospective. Because if you think of the term retrospective, we're back looking. As opposed to a post-mortem to my brain says, we're completely finished with the process, so let's analyze it and figure out what we can learn from it. But we're never finished. When we're developing software, I mean, unless we're selling the product outright, we're bought out, we're leaving, have fun with the code folks, or the company's gone out of business, whatever. But I mean, this is a recurring process. So I prefer to think of it as a retrospective. I don't know. Think of it however you want, but the process is essentially the same. I'll get that one. All right. I'll celebrate.
So before we really dig in, we wanted to take a couple minutes to just kind of ask some questions of the audience and get a feel for what some folks are doing. If you are doing retrospectives, things you've already encountered. So who has some examples of things that went wrong with a retrospective recently? Are people doing retrospectives? That can just be a show of hands. What went right in your retrospectives recently?
I'll refocus on planning.
Refocus on planning. Awesome. Wow.
So, one thing that frequently goes wrong for me with retros, and it's not something going wrong in the retro itself, is that we draw conclusions and then we utterly fail to put those conclusions into practice.
So being able to actually learn from your retrospectives, or at least put what you've learned from your retrospectives. Putting your learnings into practice. That's maybe a better way of saying that.
Have you reflected on the previous retros to actually see if there was progress made from those observations of dumpster fires?
I actually have strategies that we'll talk about later to cover exactly what you're talking about how to get action out.
So when we talk about doing retrospectives, the very first thing, we're talking about doing a thing. And anytime you want to do a thing, you do kind of need to justify doing that thing. There's got to be a reason that we do this. So there are a few key things that we want to get out of it. And the big one is process improvement. We want to identify things that we can learn from, and then we want to figure out how we're going to apply those learnings, going back to that comment in the back there. When we build software, as Bruce was saying earlier, we're always improving that software. I'm actually in a unique position because I actually often don't do that. At Ion Tank, we build sculptural installations that have some software component to them, and they get put in a building, and they're in a building now. They're done. They're literally done. I'm one of the few people that gets to actually have software that's finished until somebody calls me at 3 a.m. from Tokyo and says the LEDs are blinking blue and I can't make it stop, but that's a separate thing. But when we build software, we're constantly improving the software itself. We're improving our approach. We often talk about refactoring. I think every developer has had the experience of, I can't maintain this code as it is anymore. I'm going to just throw it out and write it from scratch because that's always going to make it better, right? Doesn't actually make it better, but you think you're going to do that. You want to improve your software, so why don't we apply that same part of our brain to improving our process? And one thing I want to encourage you to think about is the process you use for developing software is an artifact as much as the software you developed is an artifact. Your process is a thing that you can now use as a tool It is an asset for your organization. The way you do things is going to be something that you can now use to do them better. I keep wanting to hit the arrow key as well.
Yeah. Okay, so what are some of the things that keeps us from doing retrospectives, right? So this is kind of a reality check. A lot of us are in shops where we say, well, we're kind of migrating towards Agile. Some places feel like we don't have enough time to do the retrospectives, like we're going to package things in 2-week sprints and that's enough for now. So certainly lack of time is an issue. Lack of process. Could be nobody steps up to lead it. There's maybe a natural avoidance. I don't know about you guys, but I work in a shop where everything's about the Azure, and you got your times and this, and velocity and the candlestick charts, and sort of having a room full of engineers sitting around and talking for an hour feels a little kumbaya to some people. So that's kind of a hurdle to overcome. People might be worried that there's going to be finger pointing. Cultural values may not be perceived as a valuable use of time. Does anybody have anything else to add to that list? Anything that's maybe going on with you guys or that you have seen?
It's a quiet crowd.
Yeah. More sugar.
Yeah, I think that covers most of the reasons.
Yeah.
To avoid retros.
Okay.
So, in addition to just doing retros, and hopefully getting some benefits, we'll talk a little bit more about the overall benefits. But one of the other things is we don't just want to do retros for the sake of doing retros. We want to do retros that are good retros. Retros that are going to deliver some sort of value. There's a reason we're doing this. Let's make sure we're keeping that reason in mind. And so one of the big reasons is, it is an Agile best practice. It's an Agile best practice because it works. It is a valuable tool. There's no rule that says your Agile process has to be Scrum. There's no rule that says your Agile process has to include retrospectives. But people like doing Scrum, people like doing retrospectives, and there are reasons for choosing those and including them as part of your process. We really want to learn from our experiences. And not only learn from our experiences, but make sure that that learning sticks around even as the team composition changes. Right? We want to remember what works for our team, and when our team changes, we want to keep carrying what works forward, but we also have to recognize that the team has changed, and what worked in the past might not continue to work. So once again, we want to be able to adapt, and also our workload's going to change. So doing a retrospective is about learning from the past, but the past is often about 2 weeks. What changed in the past 2 weeks? What has changed about what we need to accomplish? What do we need to change in order to keep up with those tasks? So what is a good retrospective? We want to accomplish a good retrospective. What makes a retrospective a good retrospective? And I'll turn over to Bruce.
All right. Sorry, I got to come all the way over here. So
I made it bigger for you so you can actually see it
I
on the
still
screen
can't
now.
see it. I need my computer glasses and they're in the shop. So obviously, when we're doing a retro, we're doing it for a reason. We want to get organizational improvement and ownership. Actually, let me back up a step. As I said before, we do these as a function of process improvement, but that process improvement does not necessarily have to be limited to the team itself. So, for example, at my employer, we do organizational improvement and ownership. So people ordinarily think of a retro as part of the Agile process at the team level, but our company actually has Scrum. And all of the top level leadership, they actually follow Agile as well. So they have their dailies, they have their retrospectives, they go through their product briefings and everything else. So they do the same thing at the leadership level that we're all doing at the team level, which kind of makes it awesome. And then individual improvement and ownership. This is kind of an interesting aspect, right? A retro doesn't necessarily have to be limited to a team. It can be a retro of one. You can actually sit down. I mean, some people will call it like maybe a strengths and weaknesses analysis or something like that. But I've gone through this. You know, coming out of a performance review. I had a performance review, I think, second quarter of last year that I wasn't particularly thrilled with for a variety of reasons. And so I just sat down and took stock and basically did my own retro. And I said, what am I going to do to make sure, you know, that this never happens again, that I never see this kind of review again? And I sat down and put my action items in, and I sat down and said, what went right that last quarter and what didn't go right that last quarter, and what do I need to do to self-correct? So you can take the process and apply it at so many different levels. The only level I haven't done it yet is in my house. I'm not sure how that would go over. I think my wife would probably kill me, but it's possible. I mean, you can if you want. So yeah, I mean, don't think inside the box. You can really think outside the box with retrospectives.
Any questions so far? I also did a retrospective of one at the end of a project. I mean, the project went well, but I still took that time to say, okay, what went well and why? What tools went well and why? And what would I do differently and why, right?
My one-person retros tend to be pretty toxic. I don't trust that person to be part of my retros, honestly.
Yeah, I usually make sure I'm sober when I do them. Up on this one.
Right. So what you can take away from this is these are some examples of tools, some examples of approaches that you can use as you're approaching. You're thinking about, okay, what can I do? Is it just me? Is it my team? What's going to fit? What are some of the models that would work for my organization? So the most simple format, the 2-question format, what went well and what can we change? And I wanted to add a thought. You know, if you're in a 2-week scrum, you know, midpoint, this doesn't make a lot of sense to do this. But if you're in a waterfall environment or you're working on a 2-month project, use this at your midpoint, right? You don't have to wait till the end. You don't have to wait till it's all packed up and sent off. Do it in the middle, especially we get that sense like, this is not going as well as I thought it would. Then take a minute, step back. What can I change? You know, we still have a month to go. All right, 3-question format. What went well? What didn't go so well? How do we fix it? You know, what can we do? Again, what can we do differently? We've also heard kind of a rose, bud, thorn, like rose is what went well. The bud is what's emerging that we want to protect and grow. And the thorn is things that didn't go well that we want to avoid. Bruce can talk about retrospectives against humanity. Sounds like a card game.
Yeah, well, I mean, retrospectives don't have to be dry. That's the other thing. And I've done retrospectives against humanity. It was hilarious. And I actually came up with another one today that I think we're going to try on Monday for our retro, which is Yodaspective, where everyone has to give their retro contribution in Yoda speak.
Right. There is no try. There is only do.
That's exactly right. Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
Exactly our theme.
So you can do these in any variety of any approach that you want.
And we'll go into detail on a future slide.
And also to double up on this a little bit, the really important thing isn't necessarily the process. We're listing off a bunch of options that you can employ, but the really important thing is the output. And our goal for output are those actionable items. It's not just enough to sit down and list the things that didn't go well.
Right.
You have to come up with, well, what do we do about it? And that's a really important part of the retro process. The other thing is it doesn't have to be negative. Like we already said, okay, what went well, what didn't go well. But there's also an opportunity to make this a celebration. Your retro can be an opportunity to recognize both the achievements of your team and exceptional individual achievements within the team. And that's a really nice part of this. It's sort of the carrot that maybe goes with what most people think of as a stick for the retro. It also means that we're going to keep track of our successes. because you learn from failure, but you do also learn from success. Repeat the thing that works. The idea of training people by punishing them when they don't do what you want is actually a terrible way to train people. Cats are a really good example of this. As somebody who always has cats in the house, you don't train a cat by yelling at them or scolding them because they don't get that. Humans aren't that much different. What a cat especially, and what a human responds to is rewards, meaningful rewards, rewards that they can actually appreciate. So things like face-to-face praise can be a really valuable thing. Hey, Anne, I really like what you did on the last slide. Your commentary was very satisfying.
Awesome. Thank you, Remy.
And
I feel really appreciated.
And that's a valuable thing to keep in mind as you're planning out your retrospectives.
Right. So again, we've said it a couple of different ways. The most important thing, right? There is not one way. There's not one solution. How many of us are in this room? Like, we got like 20 people in the room. No two of us are doing retros in the same way. So there's not one right prescribed way. The most important thing is to get going. Be flexible. Adapt to your environment, right? So we're going to get into the tools.
Before we get into the tools.
Oh, yeah.
So we've talked a lot about what belongs in a retro, and let's talk for a minute. And the initial focus of the presentation was what doesn't go into a retro. We talked about blame-free retrospectives. So the idea of blame, if you think about this, the idea of blame is a very negative connotation, obviously, that an individual did something wrong. The problem with this is the idea of blame, or pulling somebody's individual failure, for lack of a better word, whatever, those are all HR issues, right? So if we want to build on success, if we want to grow our process, if we want to grow our product, grow our customer base, and improve, the idea of blame really should go out the window. And there are two ways to look at blame, right? So you can look at blame, number one, it's obviously a negative, but the other side of it is accountability. You still have to have accountability within the process. However, like for those of us who practice true Agile, true Scrum, the idea of individual accountability is handled in your one-on-one meetings with your manager, or one-on-one with HR if it escalates to that point. So if you want to build a process based on success, and you're putting that right in the front, right, the first thing that you're doing in your retro is celebrating success, then why would you want to kill all of that progress by calling an individual out for something that they did or didn't do? It seems kind of counterproductive. And the second thing, and we have strategies for this, is complaints without solutions. Drives me absolutely bonkers when people put into the column of what didn't go well, but they can't seem to come up with an adequate response of how to correct it. Again, we'll go into these with strategies, but these are the two biggest things to avoid, without a doubt. Let HR handle the HR issues and focus on the process. Still new. Okay, so as we talked about before, retros can be handled in a variety of different sizes. We talked about at the organizational level, the team level, the individual level, but they also can have a variety of different purposes. So initially we took this and said, well, for a true Agile or Scrum shop, you're doing it associated with your sprint. So roughly, whatever, if you're doing 2 week, it'd be roughly 2 week. But they don't have to be just about your sprint, right? You can also have a full project-based retro. So I've been on teams where we do the sprint retros every 2 weeks, and then when we're wrapping up maybe a major release, we'll have a major release retro, and instead of just the team, we're bringing in the project manager, the product owner, maybe some of our customer friendlies to talk about what it is that we launched, maybe some of the executives. Then we already talked about sprints, we talked about releases. Here's another one, incidents. We just had this today. So we have this whole process with my employer that if we have major incidents, that's a whole nother ballgame. So if we aren't meeting our 3.9 standard, or the site is inaccessible, anything like that, we will call a major incident, and we'll bring in any stakeholders that are involved with that major incident. So maybe it's the customer service rep who handled the call, it's the product owner for the team that's responsible for the product. Maybe it's infrastructure, maybe it's DevOps, it just depends on the nature of the beast. But the conversation in there, in an incident, is all about fixing the problem. There's never a conversation about who caused it. The root cause comes the following day, as does the major incident retrospective. So every day we have a major incident retrospective to go over any major incidents that happened the day before. So we're still doing retros in that case daily for those things. And again, I talked about individual before, but once again, I think the key thing, one of the key points here is that it should be configured, it being the retrospective. It should be configured by the participants of the retrospective, whoever they may be. So it's not up to a manager to come in and say, this is how we're going to do the retrospective. Because that's really not going to take a good hold. Maybe what you want to do is you want to say, okay, well, we'll do the retrospective this way once, and then let's do a retro on our retro and figure out how we really want to do it, or improve on that process. So it's up to the individuals who comprise the retro to create the retro.
So one of the big questions, if we agree that we want to do retrospectives, we want to head in that direction, one of the most important things is to identify when we're failing at getting what we want from our retros. We're trying to adopt this process. So what are some things that can go wrong? And I've listed off a couple of little anti-patterns, and I tried to give them interesting, memorable names. We're going to dig into each of these in a little bit more detail. I think as you kind of skim through, things like blamestorming, I feel like everybody kind of has just a sense of what that might be. But what I want to start with is just, kind of a real-world example of blamestorming. And I used to work for a company that was in manufacturing and had to deal with a lot of different raw materials, chemicals. And we had to build software that would manage all of the material safety data sheets for all of these chemicals so that when we brought in raw materials or shipped out product, we could say, here are all the different ways this is going to kill you. It's very, very important for compliance. And at the time, we had like 18 different business units, all using their own internal process for tracking this information. And somebody had the brilliant idea of, why don't we just have one place? So that way anybody in the company can get the information about any product that we have for safety reasons and compliance reasons and environmental reasons, kind of important. So that was the goal. As you can imagine, this was a big, complicated project that ended up involving interactions across dozens of different teams, and there were a whole bunch of different software efforts. All of them were doing their projects in slightly different ways. The whole thing was a waterfall, but some individual teams were being more agile about it, or some were doing, as you've probably seen, the scrum fall, where they say they're doing agile, but they're really just doing waterfall. But one of the key interactions I had during a retrospective was that we ran into a situation where the end users, which in this case were the people at a loading dock with trucks, needed to print shipping labels before that truck could leave the dock. They had loaded the truck, all the material was on the truck, it was going out of the factory, and it was going off to our customers, and they couldn't print the correct shipping label. And then the truck can't move. It has to sit in that loading dock. No other trucks can come in and load. The whole loading dock basically ends up shutting down until they can get that truck out of there. Big problem. So we come to our retrospective, and what went wrong? The underlying root cause was some very small little, somebody missed a requirement. But that's not what the retrospective got to. The retrospective was, well, I missed this requirement. The developer didn't implement this requirement, but that's because the requirement wasn't written down. The business analyst didn't do their job. And the business analyst was like, well, no, I did my job. The customer didn't actually tell me that this was a requirement. And the customer's like, but it was a requirement because the requirement was it has to be compatible with the existing software, and the existing software does this. And you end up going in circles, right? Nobody actually is the one who did the right or wrong thing. Everybody else did the wrong thing. I was fine. I did my job. We're not trying to figure out how to fix the problem. We're just trying to escape the blame for the problem, right? Blamestorming is very much a look for somebody else to make it their problem so that it's not your problem.
How do we fix that, Remy?
Oh boy. This is something that's a little tricky because this is very much a social interaction thing. And the best thing to do is to immediately notice that this is happening. Interrupt that and refocus on what we're actually here for. It doesn't really matter who missed the requirement or specifically why the requirement was missed is interesting, but not what we're trying to solve in the retrospective. We're trying to identify, this is what went wrong. What do we need to do to fix and correct this? And so we can also ask the person to reframe that. It's not that we missed this requirement, right? It's not that someone missed this requirement. It's that a requirement wasn't implemented in this release. And if we try and reword our statements and try and refocus and really just be aware, hey, wait a second, let's pause. We're going off path. This isn't the direction we want to go with our retrospective. We need to think about what we can do. What is something actionable on this?
Can I add to this?
Mm-hmm.
So one thing I want to add here is I had a retrospective that I was involved in several months ago that we had released some software and a piece that I was working on had caused a min. And
Major incident.
yes, major incident, sorry. So of course that involved additional night call for the QAs. It involved a lot of work for our engineers, my teammates. And I actually said in the retro, I actually apologized to the team. I said, this was my code, this was my screw up. I apologize. I know that people were working late. And the team lead on our team said, absolutely not. This was your code that went through 3 QA environments, pre-environment, a demo environment, and a corporate environment before it went to production. And it had opportunity to be tested at every one of those stages. We missed it. You didn't miss it. The team missed it. So that's an approach, and that I mean, we're all trained on that as managers in our company. We're all trained on that. So I took the blame personally, and he turned it around and said, no, this is not an individual mistake. This is a team mistake. And then it proceeded into how do we correct it.
And this always goes back to the things we don't want in a retrospective, which are calling out individual failures or shortcomings, because we can't fix those in a retrospective, right? We talk about wanting actionable items as our output. You're a jerk who didn't listen to me when I was telling you what I needed from you is not an actionable item. What is an actionable item is we had a communication failure. We need to refine how we communicate. The failures are systemic process failures, not necessarily individual failures.
I love this one. Woohoo! This project rocks. There's nothing wrong with this project. Those don't work. Anyone who's sat through that retro, those kinds of retros tell me that there's fear in the room. And the reason why I say that is because nobody is willing to step forward and bring up that there are problems within the process. It's not all fun. And there's, to focus solely on metrics, you miss the bigger picture. And there is a much bigger picture. Metrics only accomplish so much. I have a manager right now who really takes a fine-tooth comb to the sprint burn down. And that's really not representative of what's actually going on with the team. I mean, he okay, fine. I mean, it's helpful. But what it really boils down to is this approach. If you see that last point, the management needs confidence. Yeah, this is going to go nowhere if that's what this process is intended for, is to provide metrics to upper level management that the world is great. That's not what a retrospective is about. There's no way that you're going to improve your process if that's what you're trying to accomplish. So, yeah, as I said, it's politically safe. It's certainly not the whole story. So if we want to course correct this, there are a variety of things that we can do. Not the least of which is, and I should say, a lot of times this happens when you're in a bigger group. So what you can do is you can split into smaller retro groups if you want. Some of the other strategies we'll talk about in more detail later, but you can break the retro up. In other words, there's no reason why a retro has to take place all in one seating. You can do pieces of the retro in a variety of different ways. But the biggest thing to remember, and I keep reiterating this, is that it's about process improvement. It's not about management appeasement. Mm-hmm. You know, I sit through these product briefings, and the president of the company and the vice president of the company, they love certain stuff and they hate certain stuff, and they're not afraid to let us know. But, you know, that's all fine and good, but our team still needs to be able to function as a team, and that's really what it's about. I think you went too far.
Oh. Yeah, one back. Okay. So what is the bucket of crabs, right? And actually, this was Remy's idea, and he said, well, you know, there's a bucket of crabs, and one crab is trying to like get out of the bucket, and the other crabs are pulling the other crab back down. So just like in The Godfather, every time I try to get out, they pull me back in. So we got to remember the retros are for the team and for improvement, right? Maybe not everybody wants to improve, right? Some people really want to just play it safe. I'm just going to be quiet. I'm going to do as I'm told. I'm not going to rock the boat. So, you know, you got to get your antennas going. You don't want to like shoehorn somebody into doing something that's going to make them unhappy, right? Because, you know, what if you get into that situation and now somebody is using the time to kind of pull everybody else down? This is a variation on the blamestorming and complaining. Right? Let's be honest, sometimes in our culture it's less risky to complain, right? Than it is to offer up solutions. It's less risky to complain than it is to say, let's try to do things a little bit differently, right? So you can set your guidelines early and often. This is, again, you know, you got to intervene before it gets going too far. Get buy-in from the whole team about the process. Start small. Maybe it's not the whole team that's involved. Maybe it's you and the team lead. You guys could start it. Talk with people individually ahead of time, right? Some people might have private concerns that they don't want to have aired in front of the whole team. So be aware of the other things that are going on. And what we call like the pro tip, right? Be willing to hear a concern. That may not be your concern. You may even not agree with it. But if people have a legitimate concern, be willing to hear it. Give them the space to talk about it. Be willing to hear that different perspective. So that might be a little bit of a gray area between like an outright complaint versus this is a legitimate concern that needs to be part of the picture.
There was a Scrum Master that I worked with. This was an organization where the Scrum Master and the project manager were the same person. Not something I recommend. But when the project was going well, we had very open and forthright retrospectives. And she was taking notes through the whole thing. And then when a deadline slipped, and management was like, why did the deadline slip? Oh, well, Remy did this thing wrong, and then Jan did this thing wrong, and so on and so on and so forth. It was very much one of those, we don't have to improve, because now I just have all the ammunition I need to throw everybody else under the bus.
Yeah, variation on blamestorming, it's no good.
Another one, and it's similar to blamestorming, there's times where people come to the retrospective not to improve, not even to figure out who to blame, but for revenge. And this is one I actually once was kind of guilty about, or guilty of. I used to be the source control manager. I ran the source control server and the automated build server, doing all of our CI stuff. And we had users, developers requesting, hey, we have to do a bunch of stuff in Project Server. And we're also trying to do burn down charts in Visual Studio Team Foundation Services. Can we glue those together? Like, sure, can totally glue those together. We can flip a switch on our end, and then the project management team just has to flip a switch on their end, and everything's going to work. And that was what we wanted to do, but the project management team started erecting obstacles because they're a project management team. They're all about having a process. And they didn't want to flip this switch until we had a 30-page document that explained why somebody would want to do this, how they're going to do this, when they're going to do this, all of these different things. It's like they just want their time to flow between the two systems. We don't need a process document for this. And it comes time for us to have a little touch-base retrospective about how our integration process is going. And this also happened to be my last week at the company. So I just decided it was time to let rip. And it's probably the closest I ever got to yelling at someone during a meeting. This was not a good thing that I did. And it's something that we could have avoided. It was very much an interpersonal conflict. We had very different perspectives about how the process should run, about what the goals were, and very different attitudes about how we interact with each other. And so we really need to make sure, as we lay out the process for our retrospective, that we have very clear standards for what we are going to do. And as soon as we start drifting off, somebody in that retrospective has to be ready to say, hey, this is not what we're here for. This is not what we're trying to accomplish. We need to identify what those underlying dynamics are. Why is this such a conflict? Why do these two people or these four people or whatever it is, why do these people have it in for each other? There's something beneath that. Maybe we can identify the root cause there outside of the retrospective and address that so our next retrospective runs more smoothly. And in this case, we might need to restructure the teams. We might need to just, you know what, those two people don't get along, don't have them work together. Maybe that's what you need to do. I was leaving the company, so that was fine. As it turns out, that project management person also left the company a short time thereafter. So see, team was restructured and that switch never got turned on.
Oh dear.
So let's talk about this one. This is another fun one. The murder. So you sit in a meeting and basically in the retro, everybody is making noise and generally speaking, it's complaint. That's usually what happens here. Is it's just complaint after complaint after complaint after complaint. And it's a lot of people talking and not a lot of people listening. And I've sat through these, they're ugly. But again, as we talked about with one of the earlier issues here, it might just be that this retro is big. You know, this team is big. And like I said, there are ways to handle this. This second point is a really big one. You're not going to be perfect. A process improvement is going to be a long-term evolution. So if you go into a retrospective thinking that anything in this process is going to be perfect, you're looking at the wrong thing. So course correction on this, and I've done this before. Things get out of hand. People are bringing up the same thing over and over and over again. There's no reason why you can't use something like Robert's Rules of Order. Give me 3 pros, 3 cons, and we're moving it along, people. If anyone has anything else, we can bring it up after the meeting. But give me 3 different pros, 3 different cons, and then we're moving it forward. You can break the team up. The 5 minutes of collaboratively making your own list, that'll work. Some of the other things that I like to do here in order to keep things a little quieter, for example, there's no reason why you can't announce the retro ahead of time and actually have the ideas before everyone comes into the retro room, and they're already voted on, they're already prioritized. I'll talk about those in more detail, some of the strategies there. But those go a long way to limiting the noise because you already have basically a team-defined agenda. So.
So our next big goal is, how do we actually adopt retros? How do we get a retro process? How do we improve our current retro process? What do we do from here? And so, again, at the very beginning, we brought up a list of common obstacles. We don't have time to do retrospectives. We don't have a process for doing retrospectives. Nobody is saying, hey, I'm going to be the person who's going to lead this retrospective. We don't want to do the retrospective because we know it's going to be difficult and it's going to be challenging and it's going to involve some social issues that we're going to have to manage. It's hard to say whether retro was successful or not, or if we're getting our benefits, so it's a little vague. The kumbaya thing was brought up earlier. Our leadership just might not see the point, right? Doesn't deliver new features, doesn't deliver new functionality. Why are we doing this?
See the screen and people at the same time. Okay, so we're kind of breaking down some of these obstacles and talking about specific strategies. So I know at my company, lack of time is a really major thing, and I'm sure that that's true at a lot of other companies, because you talk about getting a whole room full of engineers together, and management's thinking, gee, that's a lot of cost, you know, everybody could be putting extra hours into project X, right? So a team of 10 is allocating 10 hours on the retrospective, right? If everybody's in the room for 1 hour. But what we're trying to focus on is, what are the benefits of that, right? Do we think about how the benefits are going to outweigh the time commitment? You know, I was in a meeting yesterday with one of our top management. He kept saying ROI, ROI, right? So we talk about return on investment. What if we find a better way to do what we've already been doing? You know, is that going to shave some time off as we go forward, right? So the time that we're saving is going to multiply across all of your future sprints. Another strategy here, the lack of process. Oh, we're not going to do it because it doesn't work. Well, clearly that's not true, right? I mean, Agile has this as part of its manifesto for a key reason. Learning and growing is part of becoming, you know, you build efficiencies, right? People may have had bad experiences doing retros because they were doing it wrong, right? But none of us have any excuses now, right? We've all been at this talk, and we have tools to approach doing the retros in a lot of different tricky environments.
Let's give us another 20 minutes, you'll be out of excuses.
Let's keep our time.
Yeah.
Is this one mine?
Yep.
So let's talk about leadership. Nobody steps up to lead the retro. In a true Agile shop or Scrum shop, usually the team lead or the Scrum Master is going to take that role. However, some organizations, they're not that well defined. But one of the strategies that I love is rotating the leadership role. And the reason I really enjoy doing this, I did this when I was running a team, is that you get the best practices out of every person who runs the retro. They're going to take a look at who ran the retro before them and say, I really like the way they ran the retro, so I'm going to do those things, but I didn't like what so-and-so did before, so I'm going to drop that. And you wind up with this continuous process of improvement in the leadership running the retro. It's a great little strategy. Plus, it gives people an opportunity to lead where they might not have ordinarily had an opportunity to lead. And it's just kind of that little test run, right? It's that little half hour or hour meeting that they get to run. They wouldn't normally get to do anything outside of their core role, you know, whether it's QA or UI, UX or development. So again, rotating the leadership role has a lot of benefit.
Before we leave that slide, if any of you were part of the Pittsburgh Agile meetup, there was a whole meetup on that a couple of months back, talking about how the Scrum Master, you know, the advantages of having that as a rotating position within the team, so that, you know, your whole organization becomes more resilient. It's not just one person who's got like the magic, you know, wand to make things happen. It's people rotating in and out of that role and sharing that responsibility and sharing the learning across the organization.
May as well continue because this is...
Oh, yeah. Okay. So strategies to overcome. Natural avoidance, right? So maybe that's true for people who've never really seen a good retrospective. There might be some natural avoidance that you have to kind of overcome. So how do we do that, right? Seems risky. It's new, it's different. Maybe people have had Remy's experience where somebody was like really gunning for them in the retro, and that's no good. So if you don't already have a process started, you can be an advocate within your organization. Start with yourself, right? And Gandhi say, be the change you want to see in the world. Start with yourself, be an advocate. Get somebody in a senior role, start taking them out for lunch. See if you can get the ball rolling that way. If you can't do it as a group, we've talked about this before, build your own personal habit or even work with one other teammate, right? In fact, this is where I am. Our organization, the organization I'm in now, we don't do retros. I had coffee with my product owner this morning. She said how she's been doing retros by herself. And I was like, hey, me too. So there we've got 2 people on the team. We can start working that together. You've got a process, but individuals who don't want to participate, right? The facilitator can reach out. Hey, Bruce, what can you add?
You really want to know?
You'll be like, Anne broke the slide. No, I didn't. Well, you can reach out to them offline, right? You've got a valuable perspective as an XYZ position. What's holding you back from adding comments? You can try approaching people, in real life. That goes back to that part we talked about, hearing a concern. Part of that is creating a space, for people to say, hey, I don't want to do that because XYZ,
One thing to add?
Yeah.
Just as we were talking about blame earlier, I always say this, that you never use the word you in a retro, but the one place that you use the word you is in celebration. And if you start a retro in celebrating what went well and respecting the individuals and calling out the individuals for the good things that they contributed, then a retro doesn't appear to just be a negative fest. Mm-hmm. And people are going to be more willing to carve out the time to attend it and contribute to it.
Right. And that's a really easy rule of thumb. Yeah. If you're focusing on processes, not on the individual people who did something.
When we're talking about the cultural values, your organization just doesn't have a culture of reflection and retrospectives. It's never going to be on your critical path, right? A retrospective doesn't deliver new functionality, does not fix bugs, except in your process, does fix bugs in your process, which is what we really need to focus on, right? Our team wants to own their process. If you think about, there's the threefold or the 3-factor theory of human motivation, right? People want to have an understanding of the purpose of what they're doing. They want to feel that they're competent in what they're doing. And they want to also feel that they have autonomy over what they're doing. And they get to decide how and when and in what way to approach different tasks. This is one of the most important ways to motivate people. And a retrospective gives you a little bit of all 3 of those, right? We can use it as a tool for improvement and celebration of success, which helps people feel competent. We get to own the process. We get to change it and make it what we want, giving us autonomy. We understand how we relate to everybody else in the team, which helps us understand our purpose. Why am I personally on this team? Because I have this thing that I can contribute, right? And that's a very important thing. This is one of those opportunities where while your organizational culture might not yet value retrospectives, they do value happy and successful employees, or at least they should. And this is one of the ways that we're going to be able to get there. We celebrate our successes. We don't focus on negativity. We focus on how we can improve. The other one is if we don't have a process, we're not going to be successful at doing retrospectives, which is true. So we need to build a process. We're not going to get any benefits from retrospectives if we don't do retrospectives, right? You can't succeed at something you don't even try to do. When people have had bad excuses, as we said before, they weren't doing it right, but we've now got a few tools. One of the most important tools when we talk about building a retro process and getting to blameless retrospectives, The retro itself is subject to retrospectives. During your retro, you can identify how your retro's doing. Is it helping you? If it's not, why not? What can we change in how we do retrospectives? Do we need to gather feedback before the retrospective so that we've already got a document that we can sit down and go through? Do we need to anonymize things better? Do we need to play a game like the Yodaspectives? What are the things we can do? We can change it. We are never going to be locked into a single process. That's why we're doing retrospectives.
So just a couple of quotes, some wisdom. You don't have to eliminate the conflict. We're not talking about everybody's moving to happy land. We're talking about coming to terms with the real issues that are happening in our teams and figuring out a way to kind of harness that and learn from what's going well and what could we be doing differently. It's about creating that space to make that a more positive experience, getting some skills and shaping it, right? So this is a quote that I've heard a couple of times, and I don't know, I think it's really true. It's been very true in my experience. When you think the same as your team, you can go faster, right? If you have everybody's very homogenous, there's a lot of homogeneity in thinking, experience, that team could probably go pretty fast. When you want to have a better solution, you've got to build a team where everybody's got a little bit of a different perspective. You've got to use that diversity of thinking. My product manager, when we met this morning for coffee, and I was kind of asking her, how are things going? And she said to me, she says, one of the great things I really love about you is you think out of the box. And I was like, wow, like nobody ever said that to me before. But, I could see she was really genuine. And I feel like that's part of this, right? So, bringing those different perspectives coming into that, we're building products that people are really happy with. And so she's happy, and so I'm happy too. And that applies to your retros. Don't expect that you're going to go in and everybody's going to be the same, or all your retros are going to be the same, or everybody's going to be as willing or as unwilling as you think. Hear, listen, and create that space and be intentional. And just start is what it's all about. Just start.
So
And
now that we
we're
kind of
gonna
have a
try to wrap it up, right?
yeah. Now that we have a direction that we want to head, what are some tools that we can bring to bear? How can we build this process? We know kind of what our goals are. We know what some of our stumbling blocks are. What are some things that we can do?
So, again, we've talked about this before, single leader versus rotating leadership. Not going to get into any great detail there, but here's a question, right? Does the team leadership actively participate in the retro? That's a question for the team. For some teams they do, for some teams they don't. Doesn't really matter. It's totally up to the team. But as we said before, the retro leadership should be the team members. It's not management. It's for the team and the team members to formulate a way to move forward. The responsibilities, again, keep the retro on the process, identify the action items. This is one of the biggest things. And one of the things that we do, actually my current manager is really good at this. You brought this point up at the beginning of the meeting. Everything that we bring up in a retro should be actionable. Otherwise it's just a complaint, right? So you have this column at the end of things that you want to accomplish out of this retro. So what we do is we actually have an epic that is comprised of the action items that came out of the retro. So those are added to the following sprint. So those are things that we want to accomplish.
And it might not be something that you can accomplish the next sprint, but you're saying this is where we want to go. It's either an action item or it's a goal of where you want to go. right?
Yeah, absolutely. So
Yeah.
they don't have to be completed necessarily. And that's why we throw them as 0-point tasks on the board. So maybe they go across, maybe they don't, but at least there we can keep track of them. We have an epic for them. Makes it nice and easy. And you know, again, as far as retro leadership, making sure that everybody has a voice. It's an opportunity for everybody to say what is important to them. And there's some ways that we can categorize those at the end, that we'll get to. Let's continue on here.
So the other thing, and you can bring all sorts of technological tools to bear, right? What are some things you can do? You can use things like Trello and all the other bazillion different little tools. You can use a spreadsheet. You can use, it doesn't matter what tools you use, right? Doesn't really matter, but you do need some sort of process, and a tool is a great way to support that process. If you use something like Trello, people can write their own little cards for what they want to talk about during the retro before the retro happens. You can rank them by order of importance, and then during your retro, you have now a thing you can just, the facilitator can now run that meeting. Here's what we're going to talk about next. Here's what we're going to talk about next. We have an agenda ahead of time. Don't get hung up on the specific tools, right? It's not about the tools. The tools are there to support a process. A tool could just be Post-it notes that somebody slaps on a door before the meeting, right? Or during the meeting. It can be a whiteboard. You don't have to use a technological tool. Figure out what works for your team. Retro it and change it if it doesn't work. You can use all sorts of other little management processes. We brought up the Robert Rules of Order. I mean, this is used by everybody from the PTA to legislative bodies for a reason. There's a process to this that we can use. We don't even necessarily have to grab their specific rules, right? We have the 3 pros, 3 cons. That's a great example. Any rule you can set that helps you focus on your agenda to get to your outputs is a good rule. And once again, you can retro your retro. You can identify the rules you want to try them, and if they don't work, try something different. One of the most valuable things is just getting the feedback before the meeting. It will help you be a lot more productive. When we worry about things like, is this a valuable use of time? If everybody on their own takes 15 minutes to list off the things they want to talk about in the retro, and the facilitator has that ahead of time, we're going to be able to have a much more effective retrospective. And that's one of the most powerful things you can do.
And just adding on that, one of the advantages, you don't have to do that, but one of the advantages to doing that is that you can start to see trends, right? It's like, let's say you have 10 people who are dropping off emails, Slack messages, Post-it, whatever. And all of a sudden you've got 8 people who are telling you like exactly the same thing, right? And we say, you got to listen, right? Hear that and think, okay, how can we kind of structure that? And also getting those ahead of time can also kind of give you a heads up when we talked about, reshaping, reframing, interrupting the complaining. It's a good heads up. It's not necessary, but it's helpful to have that.
One other thing with getting the items in advance is, and again, I did this and I've had managers that do this, you send out a reminder maybe every other day, maybe 3 days a week to say, hey, I've already set up the retro for the upcoming retro. So as soon as I'm done with one retro, I set up the next retro, I give everyone the link, and then I remind them every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, hey, don't forget, add your stuff to the retro, because that way, if we have a 2-week sprint, I'm not going to remember everything. I get to the end of the sprint, retro's next Monday. I don't remember what I did Friday, much less two Mondays ago. So it gives everybody on the team the opportunity to enter when they have it fresh in their head. Then we can get to it in the meeting.
The other thing is, and being prepared is going to help with this, but even if you're not prepared, having an intentional order in which you're going to go through your items in the retrospectives is useful. And so 2 example orders would be doing a horizontal cut, right? We're going to go with what went well, and then we're going to move on to, we're going to go discuss one thing that went well, sorry, misreading the slide,
Yeah.
Then one thing that needs improvement, and some action items that we're going to get out of that. And we go horizontally across. What went well, one thing that went well, one thing that needs improvement, and the action item that we're going to take from that 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. That is the horizontal cut. You're mixing up your goods and your bads. You could also do a vertical cut. Hey, let's just go. All of the things that went well, all of the things that need improvement, and all of the action items that we want to take away from this. Which one works? Depends on your team.
Right.
And there are plenty of other options you could do. You could just go in a random order, right? You could go in order of priority. You go in reverse order of priority. You can go in rough guess of what's the low-hanging fruit, what's the easy wins. Opposite, you can go, well, what's the hard stuff? What do we really need to spend a lot of time to fix? Doesn't matter what you do as long as you do it with intent. There's no wrong way to do this aside from just, whatever. The other really big thing to stress, this is your slide.
It is? I didn't write that.
Oh, okay.
Did I?
It's got your name on it. That's okay.
Okay. I think so. Hey, it's okay. We're saying the same thing again. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
Retro, your retro. Although I do like that line, right? Your retro isn't specifically a pet, right? You buy a pet, you're responsible for the pet. You can only change the pet so much. Pet's going to do its own thing, and you're responsible for it. That's not what a retro is. It's a tool in your toolbox. And if the tool isn't working for you, change it. Modify it. You own it. It is yours to do with as you please.
Right. So as you're in the retro, you're being aware not just of what people are saying, but you're kind of paying attention to what's happening in the dynamics of the team. Like, wow, everybody's quiet when we get to this part. So think, what can I do to change that up? The vertical cut, the horizontal cut. Okay.
And so with all of that in mind, right, we want to implement retros in our organizations, and we want them to be valuable. We want them to give us action items. And so as a few key takeaways, this is the one. It's the same speaker notes got copied between two slides.
Oh, okay. All right. So here's where we are, right? Talked about what is a retrospective. Talked about what the obstacles are, why your group might be doing it or might not be doing it. Talked about some strategies for overcoming those obstacles, right? And you see how we're modeling? Here's the things that go wrong. Here's the things how you can make it better. We also talked about what the business benefits are. Even though we are all at different companies, right? There's key benefits to doing this that go across industries. What else? So I'm kind of turn it over to you guys. What else?
Let's get the drink. What can we answer? Come on, people.
70% of the way through the talk, you said, I have a manager who likes to go take a fine-tooth comb to the burn down chart.
Yep.
Could you explain what you meant by that?
Every day he's posting images of the burn down every morning. Here's where we're at on the sprint. That's fine, but we all know where we're at on the sprint, right? Each one of us has our, there are filters for each one of us on the board. So I know exactly what I have to do and when I have to have it done by. To me, it's just, I don't know. If you want to cover that every couple days, maybe once a week, that's fine. Or even better, if it's seriously off the rails, maybe that's when we look at it, right? If we're 2/3, if we're 3/4 of the way through the sprint and the thing's a cliff, yeah, we probably should be talking about our process. But, and I think part of it for him is he's new to the company and he's new to the team. So we're still trying to get used to his processes and he's still trying to get used to our velocity. And we're still trying to get used to the process because we just moved, when he came on board, we moved from Kanban fire hose to more Scrum Agile sprint oriented. So we're still in a process of growing and learning. So, maybe that was taken a little, maybe it was stated a little too negatively and maybe it was taken a little too negatively, but that wasn't my intent. I'm just saying he pays an awful lot of attention to the sprint burn down and maybe that's where his comfort zone is in terms of assessing our velocity.
Well, I
Just
bet
wasn't
that's
quite
true,
sure
right?
what
Because
that
like
fine-tooth comb.
nobody got into trouble for paying too much attention to the analytics, right? That's like kind of a safe.
I got called out for that.
I would
See?
not agree with that.
Okay.
No, I
good.
got called out for that when I was training a
A
team.
little too much, like that. Then you get to the point of you feel like you're being micromanaged,
Mhm.
and that's
No, I meant for his manager.
for
Maybe his
maybe for
manager,
his manager.
is like, he wants to.
He's
Was
just trying
that
to.
any way to encourage you to get it done?
I didn't
any
say I agreed with it,
better?
but I'm.
Right.
No, I think
So-
what it is he's trying to find a stable base, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then move from there because he hasn't been on the team. I think he's been on the team maybe a month. I think he's been with the company 2 months, and he's just starting to figure it out. Now,
No relationship yet.
I got called out for that when I was running a team, and my whole thing was I tried explaining to them after I got called out for it was, this isn't to call out individuals for why aren't these stories moving across the board? That wasn't my intent. My intent is let me know what the blockers are and let me know if there's something I need to go to another team and say get the hell out of our way. And I can fight for the team, or I can pull in other resources and say, hey, I need I need DevOps to clear this for me, but I got to know about it, right? So in looking at the burn down, I can say, oh, well, these stories are taking a little bit of time. Is there something in their way? I'm not, not assessing blame. I just want to know, is there something I need to do?
Other questions? Yeah.
Do you guys recommend assigning action items to people? And if so, how do you avoid personal accountability?
You mean how do you avoid personal accountability? What does that mean?
Or like you were saying, avoiding blaming people, or how do you approach that if you're assuming you're assigning action items to people if you should be doing that?
I got it.
It was an interesting.
We just went through this.
Yeah.
Someone else want to take it first? I can speak to it, but
You're trying
All right.
to go.
so
Yeah.
we get a list of action items, right? Our team lead has
Well,
this list.
But let's unpack that, right? I mean, I want to say it depends on how you're wording the action items, right? So you're not, for example, I had a project where the requirements was like a giant bowl of oatmeal. I mean, combined with Swiss cheese. I mean, it was just extremely unhelpful. So I'm not going to write an action item to say, well, Susie has to write a better requirements document next time, right? That was an example when I did my own personal retro, and I had actually talked to my boss, and she said, look, if look at the requirements right away, and if they look like that again, bring that up with the team right away. So then that's like my action item to say, okay, I need to look at the requirements. I need to do that evaluation more quickly at the beginning and surface that. Like that's on me, right? I'm not pointing the finger at somebody else. So that was my hesitation to try and figure out how to frame that. So you're not saying you caused the problem, you fix it. It's more like,
You're taking up a responsibility.
Yeah, you're kind of reshaping it a little bit away from blaming the person and more into so.
Yeah, I mean, in my particular case, I mean, I had a thought where we were starting to get into some new technology on our team. We were starting to roll out. Just as an example, we have a process called Work Engine. It's basically a scheduler. It's the first time our team has taken this on, and I was kind of leading that. I got that epic. So one of the things that I wanted to make sure we were doing was we have a lot of time for grooming. And this was my comment in the retro was we have an awful lot of time for grooming, but we're not getting a ton of time for design, and certainly not for the deep dive for the engineers. And we have a situation where a couple of the engineers are really meeting phobic. So they just are. I mean, every time we come up with a meeting, they're another meeting. I don't have time. So
I'm laughing with you, Bruce.
What's that?
I'm laughing with you.
Yeah, that's all right.
Yeah.
So I made that suggestion that we need more design time, and then the action item became maybe we need to come up with a strategy where we find a frequency and a good day of the week for that design meeting and a length of time that the team agrees upon. So we put that out there, And then sure enough, it came right back to me as an action item from my team lead. And he asked me, he says, hey, can you take that on? Do you mind taking that on? And the key thing with our company is those types of action items, they fall into, because of the way our culture is within our organization, they fall into career growth. They fall into our review process. Those things, there's so many touch points with that. So I went and used our internal in-house survey tool. I created a survey tool, sent it out to all our engineers and QAs and said, what day of the week do you want it? How long do you want it? Do you want fixed agenda? Do you want open agenda? How often do you want it? They came back, I set it up, I run it. I'm like, all right, this is easy. I put a call out for agenda items on Tuesday morning, and Thursday afternoon we have the meeting. And after the first one, which was, I think we've had 2. So after the first one, yeah, the response was awesome. I mean, they came back. I was really happy about it because I wasn't sure how it was going to go. And they came back and they said, this is fantastic. We learned a ton about this new piece of software, and discussed some other technical items that we just never had the opportunity to do. So that's an example of turning an action item.
And I think the other thing that's important to stress is when we're talking about what our action items are, we're talking about process improvements, right? And that kind of goes to the examples that Bruce and Ann are both giving. How do we change the process, right? It's not about changing individual behaviors, because we can't do that from inside of retrospective. That's not an actionable thing. It's changing the process, adding a new touch point, adding a review step to our process. Those are the sorts of things that are actionable. And then the person who takes the action item, their action is to own that part of the process. They're not at fault, they're not blamed, they're taking over part of the process to help support the rest of the team. And the other thing to think about is if we're going to make these action items, Bruce was talking about them as they go up on your Kanban board as 0-point tasks. You can assign them like you'd assign any other sprint task, right? Somebody on the team can say, well, this needs to be done. I'm going to be the one who grabs that off the board and puts it in my queue.
Yeah.
No,
And I want to surface something that Bruce talked about, because we didn't even know each other before we did this talk. And so we met a few times, and coming back to that example where, somebody on my team had written those requirements and that person wasn't at the company anymore. So the point that Bruce made was like, and I think I hear Remy saying it too, process improvement is one thing, but like, let's say, for example, that there was somebody who was writing requirements and every single project, the requirements were useless. Well, now that is starting to shift more into the manager needs to have a conversation kind of thing. That is not a problem that the retrospective is going to solve, right? And so process improvement, like adding this or doing this or shifting this or doing this differently, that's one thing. Fixing somebody who can't write the requirements, that's not the job of the retrospective to solve. That's a separate conversation.
Let me give you another twist on this. 2 weeks ago, I had a situation where we had one of the engineers on my team wrote a query that took down our QA system. I had cycles available, so I wound up having to work with him. Well, I worked with him. I identified what the problem was, walked him through it, actually recorded the walkthrough. So I showed him how to troubleshoot the query, how to rewrite the query, recorded it, put the recording out on our company-wide system so that anybody else could see how to troubleshoot that, troubleshooting that situation using the tool that I brought in to do it. Because I don't think anyone else was using that tool at that point. So I didn't bring that up at the retro because that was an individual issue that somebody needed training. It didn't belong in the retro.
That's right.
Now, the fact that a query went awry and took down our QA environment, that was discussed at the retro. And how can we prevent that from happening in the future? So that became an action item. But the interesting twist on this was, after I had worked with the engineer to help him get up to where he needed to be to troubleshoot the query, and after I'd done the video, those turned into the celebration items in the next retro of what we did right. So that's the whole point, right? So I didn't call somebody out, but the actions that I took in helping that person turned into celebratory items within the retro. And actually 2 of them came from him. So.
But actually, what's interesting is, I think, so this idea of having an epic for the teams, so it's documented, the action items and all that, but then theoretically there could be some things that are more of an organizational, either individual team, individual department, the entire corporation, whatever, but there might be something that we're not doing right, that we need to be doing this, and so it could be lessons learned for everybody, not just that individual team. It's something that's
Absolutely.
So the same thing you said, that if individuals are all complaining or having same experience, that conceivably different teams are all having their, different departments are all having that same. So you start to see some commonalities. Oh, wait a second, exactly. We're not the only one. There's a common thread here, and if enough of them are talking about it, there needs to be something changed.
Right, and that absolutely goes into that whole building efficiencies, right? It's like all of a sudden you realize 4, 5, 6 teams are struggling with the same thing that's costing them an hour, 2 hours per sprint. Well, that's a math, how easy it is to see, fixing that one thing is going to save a lot of people a lot of time. Yeah. Other questions? Oh.
Well, actually, I think one thing I want to circle back to, way back at the beginning, one of our first issues somebody brought up was, how do we cement these learnings? Like, we identified what went wrong. How do we use our retrospective to fix it? And while we've not explicitly brought that back, I'm hoping that what we're kind of talking about right now is sort of helping answer some of that question, right? Making sure that your retrospective has action items as an output, and that those action items actually get acted on is really the main way that we're going to make sure that our retrospective actually gives us benefits. And making a process of retrospective so that we come back and retrospective again is how we keep ourselves honest about that too. Right, we made this action item 3 retrospectives ago and nobody's done it. Is it important? Maybe it's not. If it is, why haven't we taken action on it? And so those are some of the things that are also worth keeping in mind.
There was a comment earlier down in the front, which causes me to ask, doesn't everybody want ownership and accountability? So isn't accountability a good thing? Like, don't we want to be held accountable and hold people accountable? So,
well, there's a difference. In my mind, there's a difference between accountability and blame, number one.
Okay.
There's a world of difference. Blame is just solely negative, right? To me, blame is bullying.
Counterproductive.
You screwed up. I'm great, but you screwed up.
Counterproductive.
So accountability, yes, everybody has to be accountable for their work. There's no question. But the other side of that equation is understanding the separation between the retro as a process improvement and accountability as a process of HR. Right? So team retro is not an HR function. It's a team improvement function. HR has its own roles and responsibilities. And that's where accountability comes in. So to me, I didn't call out that engineer. I had no reason to call him out, right? My goal was to fix the problem. Now I know that he's going to have a one-on-one with his manager at some point, and they're going to discuss it. And he's going to have that conversation to say, yeah, I met with Bruce and he showed me all this awesome tool and did this video and provided me 6 other videos to go and look at. So I'm going to go and look at those, and now I'm on a path to self-improvement. Now he had that conversation with our manager. That's not my thing, right? So if he fails at that, if he goes in and doesn't succeed after going through all of that, then that's an HR issue. That's a performance improvement issue on the individual level. That has nothing to do with a retro.
Yeah.
And that's what I keep trying to tell people is leave the HR out of it.
Right.
Right? Improve the team. HR is individual.
Yeah, I think retros do a lot for building a relationship between the team.
Because you have to have trust.
Open.
Right.
And
absolutely.
To his point earlier, I find that more often than not, it's not an individual task that comes out of. It's what are we doing to change it to be better? Less frequently, it's somebody needs to, if there's an action item, it's somebody scheduling a meeting to help us talk about that more, or to help us plan more, to focus on how we are going to fix that problem.
Yeah.
Actually, to steal one of your examples, that came up a lot while we were building these slides, QA being bottlenecked.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Oh yeah.
Right. QA was backing up. This is Bruce's story. I probably should let you tell it, but
Yeah. It's, we had an unbalanced team. I mean, typically at my employer, typically we have one QA for 2 engineers, and at one point we had 5 engineers and 1 QA, and we're trying to get stuff delivered, and basically the ready for QA column had 60 items in it. And everyone else is looking at it. I got cycles available, and this was a repeat thing that came up in our retro, is how are we getting bottlenecked over and over and over and over again with QA? And at no point was it ever said that it's QA's fault. It's not QA's fault, it's an unbalanced team. And so the thing was, how do we fix this? And in the short term, it was, well, sorry engineers, put your QA hats on, drop what you're doing, let's get this column out. Knock this column out. And, for me putting my engineering hat on, that's probably a really monumentally bad idea. Engineers don't make good QA. That's just my opinion. I have a lot of respect for QA folks in that it's an art form. But we had to do it. I mean, we weren't going to be able to get QA from anywhere else. We couldn't pull them off of another team. We were, for as much as we tried to hire, we couldn't get any at that point in time. But it's something that comes up, and I mean, we fixed the problem and we got through it and we moved on. But again, at no point was it ever, it's QA's fault, they're slow. No, that wasn't it.
Right. So I see that we're at about 8:45, and so I want to give people the opportunity to kind of get up and move around. We're going to be here, so you're welcome to come up and talk with us, but. Again, please feel free to help yourself to snacks and drinks. And
can I make one more parting comment?
Yeah.
One thing before we all kind of get up and move around here. During my time as a team lead, one of the things that I focused on was trying to keep everybody's eyes front, right? So keeping everybody's focus on the task at hand, and my job was to minimize everything that was going on behind their seat. So in doing that, one of the things I wanted to make sure of, and one of the things that I always said when I was conducting interviews at Paylocity, one of the things I always told candidates, I love showing up at my desk in the morning. So if I love showing up at my desk in the morning, I want to make sure that everybody on my team loves showing up at their desk in the morning. So there's no reason why retros can't be fun. And that's why I brought up the Retrospective, or and how many people here work on a remote team? Anyone? Couple. Okay. How many has anyone ever done online happy hour? Awesome. I do that. We actually, when I was running my team, we actually, in addition to the retro, we had an online happy hour, and it was just BS time. I mean, our team covers 4 time zones, so. Yeah, we had, some of us were hanging a little late for the online happy hour, but it was fun. I found an online jukebox and everyone could contribute their music to the queue, and, it's whatever. But retros can be fun. It's all in how you think about how to accomplish them. And the more fun they are, the more positive they are, the better you're going to get out of them, or the more you're going to get out of them. So that's it.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, that's really why we're here, right? Even with the diverse experiences that we have, we're all committed to doing retros in whatever shape or form we can, because we have seen how valuable they are. So, go out and make us proud, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you. Thank you, Colin.